it's Jessica Honegger, founder of the socially conscious fashion brand Noonday Collection, and this is the Going Scared podcast, where we cover all things impact, entrepreneurship, and courage. I have been waiting for today's episode. We finally are going to cover together all things Enneagram. Now, let me give you a heads up that this is definitely an Enneagram deep dive. So if you're really just wanting a basic Enneagram 101, then there are so many people out there who have provided that. My guest on today's show is Suzanne Stabile, and Suzanne actually has her own podcast. So go check that out to get the Enneagram 101, because we go a little bit deeper here and get into some of the complexities, especially how it relates to vulnerability. Suzanne is a sought-after speaker and teacher. She's an internationally recognized Enneagram master, and she's written some of the most transformational books that I've read on the Enneagram: The Road Back to You with Ian Morgan Cron, and most recently, The Path Between Us, which is all about the Enneagram in relationships, which is some of what we get into today. My conversation with Suzanne is impactful for me because it launches us into the second section of my new book, Imperfect Courage, which honestly, you guys, this is my favorite section, if I'm allowed to have a favorite section for my book, because it really is about going together. We are better together, and that's a challenging message sometimes. And that's why I wanted to have Suzanne on, because I think when we understand the Enneagram, not just in relation to ourselves and what number we are and all of that, but really in relation to others, that's when we're able to deepen our connection with other people, which to me is what life is all about. So here's Suzanne Stabile. Get ready to move from inner reckoning to celebrating our differences. I have to tell you, I am an Enneagram addict, I guess you could say, but I haven't gone super public about it because I was waiting to do a podcast so that my people I could say, now go listen to this podcast if you don't know what I'm talking about.
Oh,
So
great.
you get to be the one to guide us there. But I want you to know, I already did let listeners know where to really go for the 101. So this is not going to be the most basic Enneagram episode. I know that there are so many resources for that, including your own. You have a podcast.
I do. The Enneagram journey is, it's actually a lot of listening on my part. I'm convinced that I'll never be able, even after 25 years of teaching, I'll never be able to speak for numbers other than mine the way people who are that number can. So my hope with my podcast is that people will get to hear their number spoken by their number.
Okay, so numbers. Some of you are like, what on earth are you talking about? Numbers. Why don't we just start off and you can give us the Cliff Notes version of what the Enneagram is. And then for deeper dives, people go listen to your podcast. But I at least want to set the ground for what we're going to talk about today.
Okay, well, I teach an ancient spiritual wisdom, and it's called the Enneagram, but Enneagram is Greek for 9 points, and it really means 9 points. So the diagram for the Enneagram is a 9-pointed figure in a circle. And my shorthand version of trying to explain what it is that it's 9 ways of seeing. I think we all kind of assume that if we're in the same room at the same time, I think we've gotten to a point where we kind of know we're not having exactly the same experience. But I think the illusion we have is that we're all seeing the same thing. And that's not true. And for probably 3,000 years, maybe longer, the Enneagram has been taught by spiritual leaders and spiritual masters and Enneagram masters to their devotees or their disciples or the people who go to them for what I would now call spiritual direction. And until 30 years ago, I'm sorry, that's wrong. That used to be 30 years ago, but 20 years have gone by. Until 50 years ago, the Enneagram masters would only teach you your number. They didn't really think you needed to know any of the other numbers because you can't do anything about anybody but yourself. But in the mid-1970s, a guy who had studied with the modern grandfather of the Enneagram, who is a guy whose name is George Gurdjieff, Oscar Ichazo and Claudio Naranjo learned the Enneagram from him in Europe and returned to South America and did some work with it, and then came to California to teach the Enneagram to a group of spiritual directors who were Jesuit priests and some therapists. And that was really the beginning of Enneagram information and wisdom being published. And so we're only living with published information since the late 1970s, early 1980s. And in that time, there's some really good work that's been written and some work that's not so great, I think. And I would say only that the work that I label as not so great is kind of trivialized in terms of the depth and potential and wisdom that the Enneagram holds. It's not dogma and it's not doctrine, so there's really nothing to push against. And I always say to people, if you like it and if it's helpful to you, that's just great. And if you don't, it's okay. And I don't have many people who push back from the table and say, I just don't think this is for me.
Mm.
I would add that some people in the beginning say that the Enneagram is reductive and how could we all fit into one of only 9 ways of seeing. But people who have been looking at the Enneagram and studying it for a long time pretty soon discover that there are other layers to the Enneagram that help differentiate people within one of the 9 members. So I land on it's just true. And then I always like to say that, particularly in promoting a book, I'm promoting my second book right now and doing lots of interviews. And when people talk to me about the path between us, I often say to them that the Enneagram is so great if you also have other wisdom and other practices and other tools that you use. By itself, I think it's lacking. And I think the only danger is that you take it to be more than it is.
I think that's a great point. And yeah, I feel like I meet 3 types of people these days. You either haven't heard the Enneagram, you've heard of the Enneagram, and it's been so extremely enlightening. I've fallen in that camp. Or you've heard of the Enneagram, and you're so sick and tired of hearing other people talk about it, or you're afraid it is reductive. And so you just you push back against it. But
Sure.
usually those people eventually take it and then they come to the other side. I think I was one of those in the third categories until I actually sat down and did some work on it. It's interesting because you really framed it up in terms of this spiritual sort of typology. And interestingly enough, my business partner and I have started going through executive coaching the last few months, and she actually studied under some of those original people that you named and is like an expert in the Enneagram, among many other things. And yet she's an executive coach and has really
Sure.
brought that into our executive leadership. Tell me a little bit more about why you frame it as this spiritual journey, because I think that's really interesting in terms of understanding our limiting beliefs and our blocks.
I'm a Christian. I'm married to a pastor, and our ministry together is Life in the Trinity Ministries. We have our own center in Dallas. And I am unapologetic about being Christian, but I'm also careful to say that there are more than 9 types of Christians. There are lots of ways of defining being a follower of Jesus, I think. And I am the all-inclusive type person who believes that God is all loving and all benevolent and all forgiving and offers grace upon grace upon grace. And in that space, the reason I think the Enneagram can well be considered spiritual wisdom is because it is a way of understanding yourself so that you might better understand who God is, and who you are in relationship to God. I'm in a world where a spiritual journey and spiritual transformation is a big topic, and it's language that people often use as trendy language who really are not on a journey towards spiritual transformation. And I think the reason for that is that when people start to get really serious about wanting to live the best life they can, in Christianity. And the Enneagram, by the way, has been found in all faith beliefs.
Oh,
So
my executive coach is definitely not from the stream,
yes,
Christianity
yeah,
stream.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah.
all faith beliefs. I'm just speaking from my perspective. And what I believe is that we are put on the planet to understand, accept, and love ourselves so that we might love other people. And I find that whatever I find to be unlovable in other people is usually something that represents a struggle of my own. So, in the context where I find myself a lot of the time, people who are on a spiritual journey run into first the fact that they don't like themselves and that they don't believe in themselves and that they don't believe in their own ability to change and experience transformation. And the Enneagram helps people get over that hurdle. And then the second hurdle that seems to present to most people is problems and conflict with family and family of origin. And the Enneagram helps get over that hurdle as well.
Okay, so I love that. I love how you describe this journey, which we go on. It's very similar to the hero's journey of, okay, I've got something to give, and then you start giving it, and then you encounter these obstacles, and you have that choice: do I sit back down, or do I keep standing and going forward? So this Enneagram journey can really help this hero's journey that we go on, because it helps you to understand yourself, but it helps you to understand yourself in relation to other people. And it can also be really disorienting. And this is my last 101 question. But for those people that are listening who maybe they've just barely scratched the surface, or maybe they came here wanting to even understand what it is, what wisdom do you give as our listeners begin to have their grand awakenings or revelations, like that very beginning process?
Well, let me, I guess, offer. I hope I'm offering and not advertising. Uh, Two books that are mine that I'm particularly familiar with in terms of being able to answer your question. So, with Ian Cron, I wrote the book The Road Back to You, and it's an Enneagram primer, and I think it's a really good one. So, for people who really
It
want to know,
is a great primer. It
thank
is.
you, thank you. For people who really want to know their number, you can't get it by taking a test. And the reason the tests don't work, the indicators, whatever they're called, in my estimation, they don't work because of their inability to accurately measure motivation.
Mm.
Because your Enneagram number is determined not by what you do, but by why you do what you do. So, I've been teaching for more than 25 years. So you can imagine my excitement at 68, which I will be in October, that the Enneagram is so hot right now. It's
Wow,
like,
yeah.
that's fun. But there are two sides to everything. And the downside to the popularity of the Enneagram, particularly in 2018, is there's really not a good shortcut to finding out what your number is.
True. That's so true. When I tell people that, they just kind of look at me perplexed, and then they don't even want to. They're like, well, what? If you can't take a test, then I don't even understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. But if you read a good primer, then you find yourself. And in the reading, you find other people. And my work's recorded too. So if you just hate to read, there's another way to get it. The thing that I would say about those two books, the second is The Path Between Us, which is my book about relationships and the Enneagram. And what I would say is, I think we have to know ourselves, understand ourselves, and offer ourselves enormous amounts of grace
Mm.
in order to be in right relation with anybody else. And I think once we've done our work and we're ready to be in relationship with others, then it helps to know, if they're sitting right beside us in a room, what they're seeing and why what they're seeing is so different from what we see.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the Enneagram is a quick, easy fix for anything. And I think it gives back tenfold whatever investment you make in learning it.
It certainly has for me. We did our first 360 feedback, or I did mine first 360 feedback a few months ago. And it was really brutal, understanding how people experience me. Of course, it wasn't all brutal. Some of it was really awesome and amazing, but it's the brutal
Yeah.
stuff that stuck out. But what was so interesting is in how the hard parts of how others described how they experience me, I immediately said, that is where I go in my basement of my Enneagram. Like, I am a 7 and I go to a 1, the worst version of a 1. And that's how I was described. And so it was so enlightening because I was able to look and go, yeah, critical, perfectionistic, like nitpicky, like all of these things. And I thought, I must be operating in a lot of stress at work, because that is, the best description of myself was, describing, where I go to when I'm alive and doing well. So I'm a 7, which means I'm the enthusiast and I'm an activator of people and I'm passionate, and I'm still on the search for my wings, to be honest with you. I some days really feel like I'm an 8, especially at work. And then I feel like relationally, I can be a 6 as far as sort of the loyalty in me and really deriving a lot of value from security in my relationship. So I kind of draw equally from both of those. Of course, I didn't relate to a 6 at all until my executive coach was like, no one's going to have a podcast called Going Scared unless they've got a little 6 in them.
Yeah, exactly. Just so you know, when I first got the email, I thought, oh, my assistant misspelled sacred.
Oh.
So,
You thought it was a sacred podcast. Nope, Going Scared.
yeah,
Going Scared.
well, I'm really excited that it's Going Scared, because I certainly probably have more to say to that than Going Sacred. So,
Okay, good. Well, and that's so much what we're going to get into, because, I am on the fear triad then of the Enneagram. So it does make sense. We teach what we need to learn. Obviously, I'm speaking towards fear because I've overcome fear myself. But I know that fear is in everyone's numbers, not certainly just in the fear triad. But knowing now what you know, read my mail, tell the listeners what this says about me being a 7 with a possible little 6 and 8 wing thrown in there.
First, let me just say that I think wings are really important when you're first learning the Enneagram. And then I think they're important if you are a 9 with a big 8 wing, or if you are a 3 with a big 4 wing. In terms of how we do life every day, I don't know that it has an extraordinary amount of influence. So I would rather talk about other parts of your number with the time that I have.
Great.
And what I would say is that, so you're in the thinking dominant triad with 5s and 6s. And that's also called the fear triad, but everybody in that triad deals with their fear in a different way. 5s manage their fear with gathering knowledge and information. And the more information they have, the more secure they feel. 7s manage fear with a smokescreen of activity. And 5s are mostly concerned about what's going on outside of themselves. That's where most of their fear comes from. 7s are more concerned about what's going inside of themselves. And what's happening inside is what they're more afraid of. 6s kind of carry the fear for both. It's real important for you to know that most people, I don't know about most, a lot of Enneagram teachers believe that the world is kind of divided into equal parts of the 9 numbers. I don't believe that. I think, and I was taught that probably about half of the world is made up of 6s. And so fear is a defining piece for 6s. It's not as defining for 5s and 7s. I would also say that you manage with a smokescreen of activity, which gives you the interest of being involved in lots of things. You have lots of ideas. You're very creative. You sometimes have to practice limiting yourself and boundarying yourself for what you really can do and can manage and can get done. You're optimistic up to the point where the way you dreamed things doesn't exactly work out. And then disappointment is something that you learn to manage with maturity. Earlier, you talked about going to the bottom of 1 when you're in stress, but actually, you can learn to go to the high side of 1 when you're in stress instead of the low side. And I think that's one of the most important pieces about the Enneagram that isn't often taught, because the high side of 1 is how you take care of yourself. And I teach that you can't take care of yourself without the number that you go to in stress.
Okay, this is new for me.
Yeah. So think about that, though.
Well, my husband's a 1. My husband's a 1, and we have a thriving marriage. Like, I'm extremely thankful for him because he is a very healthy 1. And so he does create boundaries. And even though sometimes, my inner turmoil is like, this is so boring.
Yeah.
In fact, what I feel is taken care of, and I feel boundaried, which ultimately is good for me, though hard for me to always embrace.
Sure. And what happens for him then? If you want to look at the best part of you, then watch him when he's really secure, because he goes in security to 7. So I think the fact that people misunderstand 7s, it's often because we want 7s to be 7s. I tell my people, sometimes I work with the same group for 3 years. I have a group of people I've been teaching for 20. So we've gone pretty deep into the Enneagram. And one of the things that I say to people is, when you start to really grow, when you start to outgrow your personality and embrace who you are without all of that, other people don't get real excited for you. Other people don't say, oh, thank goodness you're so much more mature than you used to be.
I'm so glad you're saying no to me for the first time in your entire life.
Yeah,
people are like, what?
exactly.
You're my yes person, not my no person.
That's exactly right. And so you don't get support for that. And I'm a 2, and I don't get any support when I back up and say that's not mine to do. And when you get more serious, people say to you, what happened to you? You used to be so much fun.
Mm-hmm.
We used to count on you to be the life of the party. So I think there's a lot that goes on in terms of expectations. And I think people love us more for our personalities than they do for our essence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, tell me this, because one of my big limiting beliefs, and it actually comes from some childhood trauma and a lie that I began to believe, which they say with 7s, you've usually had some sort of trauma and then you learn to just escape. And escaping into my mind is one of my most looked forward to activities. I'm like,
Sure.
I just love going up there. It's like
Right,
a
so entertaining.
gym. It's so entertaining. But I've realized one of my true limiting beliefs is I'm all alone in the world, and really there's no one else there to support me. So when I hear of problems, or even at work when there's a lot of stress, I realize what's going on in my head is like, I'm going to have to figure this out. I'm going to have to solve this. Is that a 7 thing, or is that more coming from some other thing in my life?
Rizzo and Hudson have they actually began teaching right after that 70s event, that 1970s event that I told you about. And they published a lot and early. And one of the best things they've given to the Enneagram community, among many, is that they gave us a list of childhood messages, lost childhood messages and unconscious childhood messages. And for 7s, the unconscious childhood message is you can't depend on other people. And the lost message is, I'll take care of you. and I'll take care of your needs. So actually, you're being attuned to other people having needs that they're afraid won't be met is because that rings true to you.
Mm.
And you have to be mindful of those childhood messages in order to overcome them or in order to do things differently. And so I think that's part of it. I think being in the aggressive stance, which means you're with 3s and 8s in what's called the aggressive stance, that has to do with the fact that your orientation of time is the future and that you're a problem solver. So when people come to you with a problem, you solve it so that you can move on, so you don't get trapped in the pain of their pain.
Okay, so I want to step back for a second because I loved how we described how the numbers in my triad related to fear. Can we go around the whole Enneagram and talk about how each number relates to fear? Because I know everybody's got fear in them.
Well, everybody does have fear, but it doesn't define for the other 6 numbers. It doesn't define behavior or understanding of information in the other 6 numbers the way it does for you. So I'll do that, but before I do that, I would rather start with the fact that 8s, 9s, and 1s are in the gut triad.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means their first response is, what am I going to do? And that's also called the anger triad. So while 5s, 6s, and 7s are trying to manage fear, 8s, 9s, and 1s are trying to manage their anger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my partner is he's an 8.
Yep. And so 8 anger is straight up. Everybody knows they're angry. They know they're angry. They don't hide it in any way. And then when it's over, it's over. Like once they say they're done. 1 anger, and I would guess that you see this in your husband probably, is turned inward first.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
They
he's
get
got a
angry with
9 wing.
themselves first.
Mm-hmm.
And then they generally express their anger as resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And 9 anger is passive aggressive. So certainly 8s, 9s, and 1s struggle with fear, and certainly 5s, 6s, and 7s struggle with anger. But it's not their primary struggle.
Right.
Right. 2s, 3s, and 4s don't as easily fit a category as the other 6 numbers do. And so there's a differentiation among Enneagram teachers from all of the last at least 40 years as to what would be the equivalent of anger in the gut triad and fear in the thinking triad. I teach that triad as the relationship triad.
Really? 2, 3s, and 4s you call the relationship triad?
Well, I sometimes do, and I sometimes call it the feeling triad. And the
Okay.
reason I do that is because feelings determine so much for them. So here's how they manage feelings. 2s feel other people's feelings, but not their own. And so when you ask a 2 what they feel, it's very difficult for them to tell you. They generally report the feelings that they pick up in the room or from other people.
Mm-hmm.
3s take in information with feelings, but they don't use feelings to process that information or to make sense of it or decide what they're going to do. And 4s don't like average feelings. 4s exacerbate feelings. So if they're sad, they like to be sadder because it's richer and it has more texture. And if they're happy, they'd like to be happier. So while in those different triads, we're working with the thing that's dominant for us. Fear is just not the thing I deal with every day.
Okay.
Feelings are the thing I deal with every day. And so in terms of my being thinking repressed as a 2, what I always say to 2s who say, I think all the time. And I say, yeah, you do. And about 85% of the time, you're thinking about relationships. And they all nod their heads, yes. That's what they're thinking about. So this is kind of what I was talking about at the top of the podcast when I said There are so many layers of Enneagram work that people
Mm.
can do that each layer is so helpful and adds so much to the first layer, but they all depend on you accurately identifying what you're numbering. And that always brings me back to you can't do that with a test or an indicator.
Okay, so I want to bridge this to talking about courage because that is the series that we're doing right now. Have you spent much time thinking about this idea of courage, and if you have, how do you define courage?
My context for courage is, do I have uh, the courage to do what's mine to do?
Mm.
Do I have the courage to discern what's mine to do without primarily focusing on how it's going to affect me? So for my podcast, I interviewed a couple today, and she is headed to. They're married and they're both in ministry. She's going to Iliff to get a doctorate in theology so she can teach, and that's in Denver. And he has a job here as a United Methodist minister at a church that he loves, doing work that he loves with people he loves. And they explained to me that they discerned that it's time for them to move to Denver, for her to go to Iliff. And it's not like he's getting away from something. He's giving up what he loves to answer what they consider at this moment to be a call on both of their lives. That's courageous to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Oh.
courageous for both of them. And it's very courageous of him because he's a music minister in a church that is really appreciates him, and he's very successful there. And both of them, as aggressive numbers, are particularly interested in justice. And he serves a church that's interested in justice. So I think courage, actually, in my world and in my way of thinking, is about being faithful.
Mm.
Do I have enough courage to be faithful?
Well, and I think that comes from the ability to take a meaningful risk without knowing the outcome. Because what requires courage in there is that you don't actually know how it's all going to pan out, but you're moving towards it anyway.
Right. I I get asked to do an hour talk frequently, and sometimes it's short notice. Can you fill in? Could you teach this class? Could you speak to our group? And so I came up over a 10-year period with about 10 talks that work for that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is I took the book of Jonah and I put it with 4 mantras. And the 4 mantras are really old, but they are: show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't get attached to the result.
Mm-hmm.
And those are courageous steps.
They
To
are.
really show up is courageous.
Mm-hmm.
To pay attention is courageous because life will affect you if you pay attention. Telling the truth is evidently so courageous that most people really struggle with it.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes do. But the big one for me is not being attached to the result.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot to believe that I'm doing my part and that I did what was mine to do and that I was faithful and that whatever happens with that's really not my business.
So would you say then that even though my triad we're trying to manage our fear,
Right?
every number has certain blocks towards this path to be courageous, this path of being able to move forward and not be attached to the results? And
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. But the results for each of us, what we're trying not to attach to, would
Is
be defined by our
different. Okay,
number.
let's do that. That's interesting to me. So, because I use this a lot in my talks too, is I say, that anxiety is the fear of a certain outcome. And it's when we attach our identity to that outcome that we become paralyzed. But when we can let go of that outcome and ultimately know that our identity is not a result from that outcome, we can walk in freedom. So I'd love to know what what are we attaching to the outcome? I imagine as a 2, you're attaching otherness.
Well,
How
absolutely. The outcome for me is, do they like me and do they
Okay.
want me?
Okay, so that's what you
I
want.
sure hope I made their life better. I sure hope I made their life better, but do they
Okay.
want me? And an outcome for a 3 would be, was that successful? For a 4, it would be, was that unique? Was it meaningful? Was it different than what they normally experience? For a 5, it would be, was it accurate? Was it deep?
Mm.
Did it have any kind of value that would connect it to my expertise? For a 6, it would be, did it create safety? Is it safe? Am I safe with these people? Do they feel safe with me? Did it make the world more safe? For a 7, it would be, did people get that and can we move forward? For an 8, it would be, have I affected this group of people? Have I affected the conversation of this problem? And then they move on. And they actually believe that they can affect the world without being affected by it.
Right. That's so
For a
true.
9, it would be, did I cause conflict? Did what I say cause any conflict?
My mom is a 9, and I swear that has been one of the biggest Enneagram takeaways for me because she's also is a stay-at-home mom, and I think I attributed a lot of her passivity to this, like, well, this is what women did during her time, and now I'm breaking, and then I'm realizing, no, she was just a peacekeeper, and she and my brother are 9s, and my dad and I are 7s, and it was
Yeah.
crazy. It was such an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic in our family.
I want to come back and talk about 9s in a minute because I have a really good example, and I may use the example for every number. But
Okay.
1s would say, was it perfect? And they'd
Yeah.
focus on the mistakes and not what they accomplished,
Mhm.
right? All right. So,
That's what I do. I do that as a 7 though when I'm not okay. All right.
all right. So, well, you can choose that though, and your husband will have to work 10 times harder to choose it, to choose to
Okay.
do it differently, right?
Right.
Okay. So, my husband has been in ordained ministry for 44 years. He's 71. He's bilingual in English and Spanish, and he is head of congregational care at a very large church, 16,000 members. And our church leadership was given the opportunity to send a team to the border to one of
I
the,
saw that on your Instagram.
yep, to one of the camps where children are being held.
Yes.
The parameters around that were that it was a non-political visit. So the men and women who went so that they could uh, bring theological understanding and comfort to the children. They came as a theological presence and to bring understanding and comfort and care to the children, and not to make a statement or to join in anything that is divisive. And they did it. And so, because they were able to pull that off, they've been invited to come back. And they sent a team again this weekend, and I'm sure they'll send a team again next week. Now, the thing that is tricky about that is actually easiest for a 9, because a 9 can look at anything and see two sides, and they're the only number for whom that's an ordinary everyday gift. And so, because he can fully understand a reason to be apolitical, he's able to pull that off,
Mm-hmm.
right? Be much harder for an 8 who is
Mm-hmm.
justice seeking and feels a need to correct what's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? It would be different for each number depending on how they see the world. And I think what we have to recognized in trying to not just know about the Enneagram, but understand it and have some wisdom around the use of it, is that it can be effectively used to address all of the situations where we find ourselves because it identifies difference, and difference is usually what separates us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we're going to continue to involve ourselves in either political discussion about, let's say, the environment, I'm probably not a very good person for recycling. Like I try, but I'm not serious about it, I guess. But I get it that recycling is really important and that there's a need for it and that we all need to be supportive of that. There are people who can talk that down, right? Depending on how
Mm-hmm.
they see. And we don't have patience for people who don't see like we do. And I can't remember not knowing the Enneagram, so I don't know what works if you don't get it, that
Mm.
they just aren't like you.
Well, it's really empathy, right? I think real empathy. And that's what, for my 360 feedback, when I was able to stop and really put myself in my colleagues' shoes and understand, like, I wasn't surprised by anything, right? I was like, oh, yeah, like,
Yeah.
oof, oof, I can be like that. But it's when I stopped and experienced myself through them,
Hmm.
that is when the tears came. And
Sure.
that's when the change came. And it was like, I don't want to be experienced like that, And really that is what empathy is. And I think empathy comes from understanding that the whole world doesn't, look just like how you see it. I mean, and that is key. That's key to the path of leadership. That's key to the path of being able to have dialogue, which is what we're talking about is we've lost the art of dialogue in our modern culture. And I speak the whole second part of my book really is about this. Like, how do we go it together? Because we're meant to go it together. We're not meant to go it in echo chambers where we're all exactly alike. So what are some of the tools that we have where we can go it together with people that are not at all like us and have meaningful conversations that enable action that ultimately lead to us building a flourishing world? And I'm sad I turned in an 80,000 word manuscript for a 60,000 word book. So the Enneagram got cut out. But
Yeah.
anyway, there's you do that for us.
Well, I'm sure all about trying, but um, I think the table has to be set for the Enneagram to be applicable. And that's what you did with your 60,000 words. It doesn't
Mm,
matter if I tell people how to get along if they're not willing to get in the room with people who think differently than they do.
true. That's a huge call to action by the end of the book.
I think we've gone somewhere beyond tribal. And I think it's because no one is inviting people who don't think like them.
And if we can position ourselves, first value empathy, and then begin to learn empathy and, read books that are different than what you think you would believe and listen to podcasts that you wouldn't normally listen to and befriend the person at Target that might not look like you. I mean, all of these things I think add up to creating an empathetic world where you decide, I might be this number on the Enneagram, but I'm going to look at myself from all of these other numbers and I'm going to care about how I am experienced. And I'm going to create an experience for someone else where they feel that space, which is really how we started off, to truly be themselves. That if we could all create a space where someone else can feel the compassion to be themselves, then I mean, that's the answer. The gap would grow a lot smaller, which it is. I believe it is. I'm in spaces where I'm seeing this happen.
Well, I think all of it's possible. And I think what if we were in the room together and you were talking about people positioning themselves, then I think my part would be to describe the 9 different ways of positioning yourself in the room so that you see what other people see.
Mm,
And I'm very hopeful too. I think what the Enneagram offers us is a common language
mm,
so that we can
it does,
understand difference, right?
which is powerful.
It is
It's
powerful
powerful.
if it's not
Yeah.
used lightly.
Yeah.
And if it's used lightly, it's destructive.
Right. If it's like, well, this is my number and this is just who I am, or you start tearing each other down, or like, of course you're thinking that you're a 1, you're a perfection,
Exactly.
like,
Exactly.
right.
One of my rules is never use your number as an excuse for your behavior. And another is never judge other people based on what they tell you their number is or what you think their number is.
Yes. Yes.
And
Let's do
don't use the
that.
Enneagram to hurt people, and don't talk about the Enneagram with people who don't know it, because it's insider language that doesn't help
It is.
anybody.
Yes.
Yeah, lot going on. There's a lot going on.
So many things. Okay, let's wrap up. I want to know, this is the Going Scared podcast. I want to know how you're going scared right now, though I'm happy for you to rewrite that sentence to resonate with something more that fits what you are trying to manage, which is other people's feelings. Is that what you're trying to manage?
Well, actually, right now I'm trying to manage my own response to what I think I'm called to. I have 4 children. They're all married. I have 7 grandchildren and an 8th due any day. And they all live here.
Congratulations.
Thank you. They all live here in the area.
Wow.
I am crazy in love with my husband, and I want to be with them, all of them. And, I travel a lot and I teach a lot, and I think that's mine to do. I'm about to turn in a proposal for a 3rd book if I find the courage to do it. And I am kind of struggling with it. I know what I want to write about. I think it's really timely. I think it'll be very helpful. I think my publisher will want it. But it's like, man, that's a big commitment.
Especially with 8 grandbabies and being a 2, you want to go be there for everybody.
Yeah, I do. And I keep asking myself, my husband, I'll be 68 in October, and Joe will be 71 next week. And I actually tried to get him to kind of say, let's just move to a little cabin and read books and, be with the kids and do the rest of our life. And he is wise in suggesting that maybe that's actually not the right answer to what's ours to do. So in my language, I would say that I am pretty much always trying to find the courage to do what's mine to do.
I love that because, I think we say, well, doing what yours is to do feels so good and you feel so right and it's so life-giving, but it also requires choosing discomfort.
It really does. And I think I think being led to do what's yours to do insists that you not measure what you're going to offer to the world by how it's going to affect you.
Thank you so much for joining me in today's conversation. Now you know it's out there. I'm a 7. I hope you still love me, and I love you no matter what. Go check out Suzanne, her writings and our Enneagram Mastery. Go check out our podcast. And if you liked what you heard in this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Leave a review so other people join the conversation. Our wonderful music for today's show is by my good friend Ellie Holcomb. Going Scared is produced by Eddie Kulfoltz. And I'm Jessica Honegger. Until next time, let's take each other by the hand and keep going scared.